Hello, hold on. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, I believe. It is day 388 of the occupation outside Rockford City Hall. We're going to be doing continuing our reading of A People's History of the United States. But before we get into the actual reading, I do want to say subscribe to our newsletter, subscribe to our podcast at May 30th Alliance Podcast. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, trying to think what else. I think we're on everything, really. I think we are on everything at this point. But if you need a link, message me or message the page and we can provide you with that link. And subscribe to our YouTube channel and subscribe to our Twitter. We're going to start to do spaces on Twitter. I don't know if any of you are familiar with what the concept or what the idea is behind spaces on Twitter. It's like a live, but not like a live. There's no video to it, but it's like you're in a room. It's like you're in a room, and it's all audio, and there's a host to it, but other people can talk and other people can join in as well. So, subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe to our podcast, May 30th Alliance Podcast, and our YouTube page. Day 388. Rockford reading A People's History of the United States. Tyranny is Tyranny. Chapter 4. And the reason I think that it is important to read this book, the reason I think that this book is essential and this book should actually be taught in schools, really, is because when we talk about some of these things, when we talk about police terrorism or racial injustice or these systems of mass incarceration, what we get by reading this book is by understanding and getting a more background knowledge as to some of these root causes, and we can attack these root causes and learn and be more educated about the root causes of these issues. So chapter 4, Tyranny is Tyranny. I just checked the audio, so it should be good, but if there is any audio problems throughout this, let me know and we can fix those. Chapter 4, Tyranny is Tyranny. Around 1776, certain important people in the English colonies made a discovery that would prove enormously useful for the next 200 years. They found that by creating a nation, a symbol, a legal unity called the United States, they could take over the land, profits, and political power from the favorites of the British Empire. And it's an important thing that just happened right there. It's an important thing that was said in this paragraph. What they had said is they could take the power away from the favorites of the British Empire. They didn't say anything about distributing that power, equaling out that power. It's not a situation to where they wanted to take away this power and equally distribute it to all citizens of the Americas, to all citizens, to all people that lived in the Americas at the time. They wanted it for themselves. It wasn't that they necessarily had a problem with tyranny. It's the fact that they wanted themselves to be the tyrants. In the process, they could hold back a number of potential rebellions and create a consensus of popular support for the rule of a new privileged leadership. When we look at the American Revolution this way, it was a work of genius, and the founding fathers deserve the odd tribute they have received over these centuries. They created the most effective system of national control devised in modern times, and showed future generations of leaders the advantages of combining paternalism with command. Starting with Bacon's rebellion in Virginia by 1760, there had been 18 uprisings aimed at overthrowing colonial governments. There had also been 6 black rebellions from South Carolina to New York, and 40 riots of various origins. By this time also, there had emerged, according to Jack Green, stable, coherent, effective, and acknowledged local political and social elites. And by the 1760s, this local leadership saw the possibility of directing much of the rebellious energy against England and her local officials. It was not a conscious conspiracy, but an accumulation of tactical responses. After 1763, with England victorious over France in the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, expelling them from North America, ambitious colonial leaders were no longer threatened by the French. They now had only two rivals left, the English and the Indians. The British, wooing the Indians, had declared Indian lands beyond the Appalachians out of bounds to whites. The Proclamation of 1763. Perhaps once the British were out of the way, the Indians could be dealt with. Again, no conscious forethought strategy by the colonial elite, but a growing awareness as events developed. With the French defeated, the British government could turn its attention to tightening control over the colonies. It needed revenues to pay for the war, and looked to the colonies for that. Also, the colonial trade had become more and more important to the British, and more profitable. It had amounted to about 500,000 pounds in 1700, but by 1770 was worth 2,800,000 pounds. 2,800,000 pounds. I wonder what's the inflation rate on that. So the American leadership was less in need of English rule, the English more in need of the colonists' wealth. The elements were there for conflict. The war had brought glory for the generals, death to the privates, wealth to the merchants, unemployment for the poor. There were 25,000 people living in New York. There had been 7,000 in 1720, when the French and the Indian War ended. A newspaper editor wrote about the growing number of beggars and wandering poor in the streets of the city. Letters in the paper questioned the distribution of wealth. How often have our streets been covered with thousands of barrels of flour for trade, while our near neighbors can hardly procure enough to make a dumplings to satisfy their hunger? Gary Nash's study of city tax list shows that by the early 1770s, the top 5% of Boston's taxpayers controlled 49% of the city's taxable assets. In Philadelphia and New York, too, wealth was more and more concentrated. Court-recorded wills showed that by 1750, the wealthiest people in the cities were leaving 20,000 pounds, equivalent to about 5 million today. Wow. In Boston, the lower classes began to use a town meeting to vent about their grievances. The governor of Massachusetts had written that in these town meetings, the meanest inhabitants, by their constant attendance, there generally are the majority and outvote the gentlemen, merchants, substantial traders, and all the better part of the inhabitants. What seems to have happened in Boston is that certain tax lawyers editors, and merchants of the upper class, but excluded from the ruling circles close to England, men like James Otis and Samuel Adams, organized a Boston caucus, and through their writing and their words, molded laboring class opinion, called the mob into action, and shaped its behavior. This is Gary Nash's description of Otis, who he says, keenly aware of the declining fortunes and the resentment of the ordinary townspeople, was mirroring as well as molding popular opinion. We have here a forecast of the long history of American politics, the mobilization of lower-class energy by upper-class politicians for their own purposes. This was not purely deception. It involved, in part, a genuine recognition of lower class grievances, which helps to account for its effectiveness as a tactic for centuries. As Nash puts it, James Otis, Samuel Adams, Royal, I think that's how you pronounce that, Royal Tyler, Oxenbridge, Thatcher, and a host of other Bostonians linked to the artisans and laborers through a network of neighborhood taverns, fire companies, and the caucus, espoused a vision of politics that gave credence to laboring class views and regarded as legitimate the participation of artisans and even laborers in the political process. In 1762, Otis, speaking against the conservative rulers of the Massachusetts colony represented by Thomas Hutchinson, gave an example of the kind of rhetoric that a lawyer could use in mobilizing city mechanics and artisans. I am forced to get my living by the labor of my hand and the sweat of my brow, as most of you are, and obliged to go through good report and evil report, for bitter bread, earned under the frowns of some who have no natural or divine right to be above me, and eventually owe their grandeur and honor to the grinding faces of the poor. Boston seems to have been full of class anger in those days. In 1763, in the Boston Gazette, someone wrote that a few persons in power were promoting political projects for keeping the poor in order to make them humble. This accumulated sense of grievance against the rich in Boston may account for the explosiveness of mob action after the Stamp Act of 1765. Through this act, the British were taxing the colonial population to pay for the French War, in which colonists had suffered to expand the British Empire. That summer, a shoemaker named Ebenezer McIntosh led a mob in destroying the house of a rich Boston merchant named Andrew Oliver. 2 weeks later, the crowd turned to the home of Thomas Hutchinson, symbol of the rich elite who ruled the colonies in the name of England. They smashed up his house with axes, drank the wine in his wine cellar, and looted the house of his furniture and other objects. A report by colony officials to England said that this was part of a larger scheme in which the house of 15 rich people were to be destroyed, as part of a war of plunder, of general leveling, and taking away the distinction of rich and poor. It was one of those moments in which fury against the rich went further than leaders like Otis wanted. Could class hatred be focused against the pro-British elites and deflected from the nationalist elite? And again, this is not a situation where they wanted to... Clearly, they are saying that they are not interested in leveling out this power or destroying and dismantling this... what's a word that they had used? Hold on. My fault. Why couldn't I think of distinction? They weren't trying to dismantle and destroy the distinction between the rich and poor. The nationalists weren't. They were trying to take the power away from the British elites and make it their own. There wasn't. They weren't doing this for the best interest of the people, the best interest of the everyday folk. They was doing this for the best interest of themselves. In New York, that same year of the Boston house attacks, someone wrote to the New York Gazette, "Is it equitable that 999 should suffer for the extravagance or grandeur of one, especially when it is considered that men frequently owe their wealth to the impoverishment of their neighbors? The leaders of the revolution would worry about keeping such sentiments within limits." Mechanics were demanding political democracy in the colonial cities. Open meetings of representative assemblies public galleries in the legislative halls, and the publishing of roll call votes, so that constituents could check on representatives. They wanted open-air meetings where the population could participate in making policy, more equitable taxes, price controls, and the election of mechanics and other ordinary people to government posts. Especially in Philadelphia, according to Nash, the consciousness of the lower middle class grew to the point where it must have caused some hard thinking, not just among the conservative loyalists sympathetic to England, but even among the leaders of the revolution. By mid-1776, laborers, artisans, and small tradesmen employing actual legal measures when electoral politics failed were in clear command in Philadelphia. Helped by some middle-class leaders, Thomas Paine, Thomas Young, and others, they launched a full-scale attack on wealth and even on the right to acquire unlimited private property. During elections for the 1776 convention, to frame a constitution for Pennsylvania, a privates committee urged voters to oppose great and overgrown rich men. They will be too apt to be framing distinctions in society. The privates committee drew up a Bill of Rights for the convention, including the statement that an enormous proportion of property vested in a few individuals is dangerous to the rights and destructiveness of the common happiness of mankind, and therefore every free state hath the right by its law to discourage the possession of such property. In the countryside, where most people lived, there was a similar conflict of poor against rich, one of which political leaders would use to mobilize the population against England, granting some benefits for the rebellious poor, and many more for themselves in the process. The tenant riots in New Jersey in the 1740s, the New York tenant uprisings of the 1750s and 1760s in the Hudson Valley, and the rebellion in northeastern New York that led to the carving of Vermont out of New York State, were all more than sporadic rioting. There were long-lasting social movements, highly organized, involving the creation of counter-governments. They were aimed at a handful of rich landlords, but with the landlords far away, they often had to direct their anger against farmers who had leased the disputed land from the owners. See Edward Countryman's pioneering work on rural rebellion. I'll check that one out. Just as the Jersey rebels had broken into jail to free their friends, rioters in the Hudson Valley rescued prisoners from the sheriff, and one time took the sheriff himself as prisoner. The tenants were seen as chiefly the dregs of the people, and the posse that the sheriff of Albany County led to Bennington in 1771 included the privileged top of the local power structure. The land rioters saw their battle as poor against rich. A witness at rebel leaders' trial in New York in 1763 said that the farmers evicted by the landlords had an equitable title but could not be defended in the course of law because they were poor. Poor men were always oppressed by the rich. Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Rebels in Vermont described themselves as a poor people, fatigued in settling a wilderness country, and their opponents as a number of attorneys and other gentlemen with all their tackle of ornaments and compliments and French finesse. Hold on. I want to stop there and take a pause for a second. a lot of people today, with their criticisms of the protests, not just here in Rockford, but on a national level, on a global level, will say that, well, it needs to be peaceful. You need to do a peaceful protest. What about these last three paragraphs was peaceful? And this is a thing that we got to be really careful in dealing with, and really careful in when we want to change some of these systems and dismantle some of these systems and destroy some of these systems. We have to be careful that the systems that we are building in place are not oppressive to other people, people of color, to other people, to other poor people, to other oppressed parties. Because this is what happened back in the 18th century, where it was white people, it was white colonists, it was white poor people who rioted and who did these things and broke people out of jail and threw the sheriff himself into jail. But they did these things for themselves. They didn't do these things for the betterment of their neighbor. They didn't do these things for the betterment of all people of color, of the slaves that they still had. They did these things for themselves. And to where it's not much different from the rich people who were wanting to take away the people. My fault. Hold on. It's windy out here. It's not much different from the rich people who were focused on mobilizing the people to take away the power from the British. Okay, we're right here. Land-hungry farmers in the Hudson Valley turned to the British for their support against the American landlords. The Green Mountain rebels did the same. But as the conflict with Britain intensified, the colonial leaders of the movement for independence, aware of the tendency of poor tenants to side with the British and their anger against the rich, adopted policies to rent over people in the countryside. In North Carolina, a powerful movement of white farmers was organized against wealthy and corrupt officials in the period from 1766 to 1771. Exactly those years when, in the cities of the Northeast, agitation was growing against the British, crowding out class issues. The movement in North Carolina was called the what a weird name for a movement. The movement in North Carolina was called the Regulator Movement, and it consisted, says Marvin L. Long ass name. Marvin L. Michael K., a specialist in the history of that movement of class consciousness, white farmers in the West who attempted to democratize local government in their respective counties. The regulators referred to themselves as poor, industrious peasants, as laborers, the wretched poor, oppressed by the powerful and rich, designing monsters. The regulators saw that a combination of wealth and political power ruled North Carolina and denounced those officials, whose highest study is the promotion of their wealth. They resented the tax system, which was especially burdensome on the poor, and the combination of merchants and lawyers who worked in the courts to collect debts from the harassed farmers. And this is why I think that what we're reading here is we need to be our mindset into reading this has to be aware of the different things that are going on here in Rockford. And this is why I won't never be in no picture with Tom McNamara. I won't never be in no picture with any government official, because they're not trying to help you. They're not trying to change things for the poor people in Rockford. They're not trying to change things for the black people and people of color in Rockford. They're not trying to really effectively change these issues, because if they really wanted to, and if they really were focused on these things, and if they really had the mindset of wanting to level out this power and to destroy the distinction between the rich and the poor, they could have done it already. But what they are focused on, what they put their energy to, is every now and then we'll give them a few crumbs while our power continues to grow. Every now and then we'll let them have $1 or $2 while we're making thousands and millions over here. Every now and then we'll give them something small to make them feel like, yes, we got something, while we are focused on these millions of dollars over here. That's why I don't think no type of reform will work or anything like that nature. Okay, let's see. Hold on. My fault. Stop mid-paragraph. In the western counties where the movement developed, only a small percentage of the households had slaves, and 41% of those, 41% of these were concentrated to take one Hold on. I'm all discombobulated right now. To take one sample western county, and less than 2% of the households. The regulators did not represent servants or slaves, but they did speak for small owners, squatters, and tenants. A contemporary account of the regulated movement in Orange County describes the situation. Thus were the people of Orange, insulted by the sheriff, robbed and plundered, neglected and condemned by the representatives, and abused by the magistrate, obliged to pay fees regulated only by the avarice of the officer, obliged to pay a tax which they believed to enrich its I don't even know if you can call these misspellings because it was so long ago, but it's words that are spelled a lot differently than what we have spelled them out today. And aggrandized a few who lorded it over them continually, and from all these evils they saw no way to escape. For the men in power and legislation were the men whose interest it was to oppress and make gain of the laborer. In that county, in the 1760s, the regulators organized to prevent the collection of taxes or the confiscation of property of tax delinquents. Officials said an absolute insurrection of a dangerous tendency had broke out in Orange County and made military plans to suppress it. At one point, 700 armed farmers forced the release of 2 arrested regulator leaders. The regulators petitioned the government on their grievance in 1768, citing the unequal chance the poor and the weak have in contentions with the rich and powerful. In another county, Anson, a local militia colonel complained of the unparalleled tumults, insurrections, and commotions which at present distract this country. At one point, a few hundred men broke up the proceedings at a county court. But they had also tried to elect farmers to the assembly, asserting that a majority of our assembly is composed of lawyers, clerks, and others in connection with them. In 1770, there was a large-scale riot in Hillsborough, North Carolina, in which they disrupted a court, forced a judge to flee, beat 3 lawyers, 2 merchants, and looted stores. The result of all this was the assembly passed some mild reform legislation, but also an act to prevent riots, and the governor prepared to crush them militarily. In May of 1771, there was a decisive battle in which several thousand regulators were defeated by a disciplined army using cannon. 6 regulators were hanged. Kay says that in the three western counties of Orange, Anson, and Rowan, where the regulator movement was concentrated, it had the support of 6,000 to 7,000 men out of a total of white taxable population of about 8,000. A lot of people. One consequence of this bitter conflict is that only a minority of the people in the regulated counties seem to have participated as patriots in the Revolutionary War. Most of them probably remain neutral. Hold on, let me pause for a second and see how long. Okay, got about 10 pages left in this chapter. Fortunately for the revolutionary movement, the key battles were being fought in the north, and here in the cities, the colonial leaders had a divided white population. They could win over the mechanics, who were a kind of middle class, who had a stake in the fight against England, who faced competition from English manufacturers. The biggest problem was to keep the propertyless people, who were unemployed and hungry in the crisis following the French War, under control. In Boston, the economic grievance of the lowest classes, mingled with anger against the British, exploded in mob violence. The leaders of the independence movement wanted to use that mob energy against England, but also to contain it so that it would not demand too much from them. When riots against the Stamp Act swept Boston in 1767, they were analyzed by the commander of the British forces in North America, General Thomas Gage, as follows. Trying to make sure this thing don't fall over. Okay. The Boston mob, raised first by the instigation of many of the principal inhabitants, allured by plunder, rose shortly after of their own accord, attacked, robbed, and destroyed several houses, and amongst others, that of the lieutenant governor. People then began to be terrified at the spirit they had raised, to perceive that popular fury was not to be guided, and each individual feared he might be the next victim of the riots. The same fears spread through the other provinces, and there has been as much pains taken since to prevent the insurrections of the people as before to excite them. Gage's comments suggest that leaders of the movement against the Stamp Act had instigated crowd action, but then became too frightened by the thought that it might be directed against their wealth too. At this time, let's stop right there. Let's pause for a second right there. And this is what I mean we'll say when we all say that true movement, true change, true revolution will not come from anybody in this building right here. Any true change, true revolution, true revolution will not come from any government official. It will not come from any meeting, any government official meeting, any city hall meeting, anything like that. True revolution will come and will only come from the people, from the community. At this time, the top 10% of Boston's taxpayers held about 66% of Boston's taxable wealth, while the lowest 30% of the tax-paying population had no taxable property. No taxable property at all. The propertyless could not vote, and so like black people, women, and Indians could not participate in town meetings. This included sailors, journeymen, apprentices, and servants. Dirk Horder with the E, two E's. Dirk Horder, a student of Boston mob actions in the Revolutionary period, calls the revolutionary leadership the Sons of Liberty, type drawn from the middling interests and well-to-do merchants, a hesitant leadership, wanting to spur action against Great Britain, yet worrying about maintaining control over the crowds at home. It took the Stamp Act crisis to make this leadership aware of its dilemma. A political group in Boston called the Loyal Nine, merchants, distillers, ship owners, and master craftsmen who opposed the Stamp Act, organized a procession in August 1765 to protest it. They put 50 master craftsmen at the head, but needed to mobilize ship workers from the North End and mechanics and apprentices from the South End. 2,000 or 3,000 were in the procession. Africans were excluded. They marched to the home of the stamp master and burned his effigy. But after the gentlemen who organized the demonstration left, the crowd went further and destroyed some of the stamp master's property. These were, as one of the Loyal Nine said, amazingly inflamed people. The Loyal Nine seemed taken back by the direct assault on the wealthy furnishings of the stamp master. The rich set up armed patrols. Now a town meeting was called, and the same leaders who had planned a demonstration denounced the violence and disavowed the actions of the crowd. As more demonstrations were planned for November 1st, 1765, when the Stamp Act was to go in effect, and for Pope's Day, November 5th, steps were taken to keep things under control. A dinner was given for certain leaders of the rioters to help win them over. And when the Stamp Act was repealed, due to overwhelming resistance, the conservative leaders severed their connections with the rioters. They had annual celebrations of the first anti-Stamp Act demonstration, to which they invited, according to Horder, not the rioters, but mainly upper and middle-class Bostonians, who traveled in coaches and carriages to Roxbury or Dorchester for opulent feasts. That's why we say don't take no photos with police, don't take no photos with Tom, don't take no photos with Jay Hanley. They gain more from them pictures than they will ever give you. Just by taking that picture, they've already gained more by people taking picture with them than they will ever pay back to the city, ever pay back to the community, rather. When the British Parliament turned to its next attempt to tax the colonies, this time by a set of taxes which it hoped would not excite as much opposition, the colonists organized boycotts. But they stressed no mobs or riots. Let the person and properties of your most intrepid enemies be safe. Samuel Adams advised. No mobs, no confusions. And James Otis said that. No possible circumstances, though ever so oppressive, could be supposed sufficiently to justify private riots and disorders. Impressments in the quartering of troops by the British were directly hurtful to the sailors and other working people. After 1768, 2,000 soldiers were quartered in Boston, and friction grew between the crowds and the soldiers. The soldiers began to take the jobs of working people when jobs were scarce. Mechanics and shopkeepers lost work or business because of the colonists' boycott of British goods. In 1769, Boston set up a committee to consider some suitable methods of employing the poor of the town, whose numbers and distresses are daily increasing by the loss of its trade and commerce. On March 5th, 1777, grievances of rope makers against British soldiers taking their jobs led to a fight. A crowd gathered in front of the custom house and began provoking the soldiers, who fired and killed Crispus Attucks, an African worker, and then others. This became known as the Bosomatic Massacre. Feelings against the British mounted quickly. There was anger at the acquittal. There was anger at the acquittal of 6 Boston soldiers. Two, two were punished by having their thumbs branded and were discharged from the army. The crowd at the massacre was described by John Adams, defense attorney for the British soldiers, as a motley rabble of saucy boys. What does that mean? I might not be able to. I can't say that. I don't think I can say that. As boys, attorneys. My fault. That threw me off. I ain't never seen that phrase before. A motley rabble, as boys, Africans, and okay. So this is where we're gonna have to differentiate. Okay, so they use not the N-word, but the other N-word, and another term for Africans that would imply someone to be of a mixed race. Irish Teagues and outlandish Jactars. I don't even know what that is. Perhaps 10,000 people marched in the funeral procession for the victims of the massacre. Out of a total Boston population of 16,000, this led England to remove the troops from Boston and try to quiet the situation. Impressment was the background of the massacre. There had been impressment riots through the 1760s in New York and in Newport, Rhode Island, where 500 seamen, boys, and Africans rioted after 5 weeks of impressment by the British. 6 weeks before the Boston Massacre, there was a battle in New York of seamen against British soldiers taking their jobs, and one seaman was killed. In the Boston Tea Party of December 1773, the Boston Committee of Correspondence formed a year before to organize anti-British actions, controlled crowd action against the tea from the start. Dirk Horder says, the Tea Party led to coercive acts by Parliament, virtually establishing martial law in Massachusetts, dissolving the colonial governments, closing the port in Boston, and sending troops in. Still, town meetings and mass meetings rose in opposition. The seizure of a powder store by the British led 4,000 men from all around Boston to assemble in Cambridge, where some of the wealthiest officials had their sumptuous homes. The crowd forced the officials to resign. The committees of correspondence of Boston and other towns welcomed this gathering, but warned against destroying private property. Pauline Maier, M-A-I-E-R, is it Mayer or Meyer? I wonder. Who studied the development of opposition to Britain in the decade before 1776, in her book, From Resistance to Revolution, emphasizes the moderation of the leadership and, despite their desires for resistance, their emphasis. Hold on. Let me just make sure I got this page right. Okay. 7 more pages. Okay. She notes the officers and committees of members of the Sons of Liberty were drawn almost entirely from the middle and upper class of colonial society. In Newport, Rhode Island, for instance, the Sons of Liberty, according to a contemporary writer, contains some gentlemen of the first figure in town for opulence, sense, and politeness. In North Carolina, I'd be pissed if they sent me this. My fault. In North Carolina, one of the wealthiest of the gentlemen and freeholders led the Sons of Liberty. Similarly, in Virginia and South Carolina, and New York's leaders too, were involved in a small but respectable independent business venture. Their aim, however, was to broaden their organization, to develop a mass base of wage earners. Many of the Sons of Liberty groups declared, as in Milford, Connecticut, the greatest abhorrence of lawlessness, or as in Annapolis opposed all riots or unlawful assemblies tending to the disturbance of the public tranquility. John Adams expressed the same fears. These tarring and featherings, this breaking open houses by rude and insolent rabbles, in resentment for private wrongs, or in pursuing private prejudices and passions, must be disconnected. In Virginia, it seemed clear to the educated gentry that something needed to be done to persuade the lower orders to join the revolutionary cause, to deflect their anger against England. One Virginian wrote in his diary in the spring of 1774, "The lower class of people here are ready to riot on account of reports from Boston. Many of them expect to be pressed and compelled to go and fight the Britons." Around the time of the Stamp Act, a Virginian speaker addressed the poor. Are not the gentlemen made of the same materials as the lowest and poorest among you? Listen to no doctrines which may tend to divide us, but let us go hand in hand as brothers. That's some sick shit. That's some sick shit. It was a problem for which the rhetorical talents of Patrick Henry were superbly fitted. He was, as Riz Isaac puts it, firmly attached to the world of the gentry. But he spoke in words that the poorer whites of Virginia could understand. Henry's fellow Virginian, Edmund Randolph, recalled his style as a simplicity and even carelessness. His pauses, which for their length might sometimes be feared to dispel the attention, riveted it the more by raising the expectation. Patrick Henry's speech in Virginia pointed a way to relieve class tension between upper and lower classes, and form a bond against the British. This was a fine language. This was a fine language, inspiring to all classes, specific enough in its listing of grievances to charge people with anger against the British, vague enough to avoid class conflict among the rebels, and stirring enough to build a patriotic feeling for the resistance movement. Tom Paine's Common Sense, which appeared in early 1776 and became the most popular pamphlet in the American colonies, did this. It made the first bold argument for independence, in words that any fairly literate person could understand. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. I don't know if I would. No, I wouldn't agree with that. Paine disposed of the idea of the divine right of kings by a pungent history of the British monarchy, going back to the Norman. They went back 700. That's nuts. 700, rightfully so, but still. Going back to the Norman Conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror came over from France to set himself on the British throne. A French this is what they call them. A French bastard landing with an armed banditti and establishing himself King of England against the consent of the natives is in plain terms a very paltry, rascally original. It certainly hath no divinity in it. Paine dealt with the practical advantages of sticking to England or being separated. He knew the importance of economics. I challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I repeat the challenge. Not a single advantage is derived. Our corn will fetch its prices in any market in Europe, and our imported goods must be paid for by them where we will. As for the bad effects of the connection with England, Paine appealed to the colonists' memory of all the wars in which England had involved them, wars costly in lives and money. But the injuries and disadvantages which we sustain by that connection are without number. Any submission to or dependence on Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent in European wars and quarrels, and set us up at variances with nations who would otherwise seek our friendships. He built slowly to an emotional pitch. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part." Common Sense went through 25 editions in 1776 and sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It is probable that almost every literate colonist either read it or knew about its contents. Pamphleteering had become, by this time, the chief theater of debate about relations with England. From 1750 to 1776, 400 pamphlets had appeared arguing one or another side of the Stamp Act, or the Boston Massacre, or the Tea Party, or the general questions of disobedience to law, loyalty to governments, rights and obligations. Paine's pamphlet appealed to a wide range of colonial opinion angered by England, but it caused some tremors in aristocrats like John Adams, who were with the patriot cause but wanted to make sure it didn't go too far in the direction of democracy. Paine had denounced the so-called balanced government of Lords and Commons as a deception, and called for a single-chamber representative bodies where the people could be represented. Adams denounced Paine's plan as so democratical, without any restraint or even an attempt at any equilibrium or counterpose, that it must produce confusion and every evil will work. Popular assemblies needed to be checked, Adams thought, because they were productive of hasty results and absurd judgments. Paine himself came out of the lower orders of England, a staymaker, tax official, teacher, poor immigrant to America. He arrived in Philadelphia in 1774 when agitation against England was already strong in the colonies. Hold on, let me get a water real quick. Get this water. Okay. Let's see, where were we? Paine had already came over. The artisan mechanics of Philadelphia, along with journeymen, apprentices, and ordinary laborers, were forming into a political consciousness militia. In general, damned riffraff, dirty, and disaffected, as local aristocrats described them. But speaking plainly and strongly, he could represent those politically conscious lower class people. He opposed property qualifications for voting in Pennsylvania, but his great concern seems to have been to speak for a middle group. There is an extent of riches, as well as an extreme of poverty, which by harrying the circles of a man's acquaintance lessens his opportunities of general knowledge. Once the revolution was underway, Paine more and more made it clear that he was not for crowd action of lower class people, like those militia who in 1779 attacked the house of James Wilson. Wilson was a revolutionary leader who opposed price controls and wanted a more conservative government that was given by the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. Paine became an associate of one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania, Robert Morris, and a supporter of Morris's creation, the Bank of North America. Later during the controversy over adopting the Constitution, Paine would once again represent urban artisans who favored a strong central government. He seemed to believe that such a government could represent some great common interest. In this sense, he lent himself perfectly to the myth of the revolution, that it was on the behalf of a united people. The Declaration of Independence brought that myth to its peak of eloquence. Each harsher measure of British control, the Proclamation of 1763, not allowing the colonies to settle beyond the Appalachians, the Stamp Act, the Townshend taxes, including the one on tea, the stationing of troops, and the Boston Massacre, the closing of the port of Boston, and the dissolution of the Massachusetts legislature, escalated colonial rebellion to the point of revolution. The colonists had responded with the Stamp Act Congress, the Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence, the Boston Tea Party, and finally, in 1774, the setting up of a Continental Congress, an illegal body forerunner of a future independent government. It was after the military clash at Lexington and the Concord in April 1775 between colonial Minutemen and British troops that the Continental Congress decided on separation. They organized a small committee to draw up the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote. It was adopted by Congress on July 2nd and officially proclaimed July 4th, 1776. By this time, there was already a powerful sentiment for the independence. Resolutions adopted in North Carolina in May of 1776 and sent out to the Continental Congress, declared independence of England, asserted that all British law was null and void, and urged military preparations. About the same time, the town of Malden, Massachusetts, responding to a request from the Massachusetts House of Representatives that all towns in the state declare their views on independence, had met in town meetings and unanimously called for independence. We therefore renounce with disdain our connection with a kingdom of slaves. We bid a final adieu to Britain. I don't even know if you call that irony. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, they should declare the causes. This was the opening of the Declaration of Independence. Then, in its second paragraph, came the powerful philosophical statement: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. It then went on to list grievances against the king, a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. The list accused the king of dissolving colonial governments, controlling judges, sending swarms of officers to harass our people, sending in armies of occupation, cutting off colonial trade with other parts of the world, taxing the colonists without their consent, and waging war against them, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the work of death, dissolution, and tyranny. All this, the language of popular control over governments, the right of rebellion and revolution, indignation at a political tyranny, economic burdens, and military attacks, was language well suited to unite large numbers of colonists and persuade even those who had grievances against one another to turn against England. Some Americans were clearly omitted from this circle of united interests drawn by the Declaration of Independence. Indians, black slaves, women. Indeed, one paragraph of the Declaration charged the king with inciting slave rebellions and Indian attacks. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is the undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. 20 years before the Declaration of Independence, a proclamation of the legislature of Massachusetts of November 3rd, 1755, declared the Penobscot Indians rebels and enemies and traitors, and providing a bounty for every scalp of a male Indian brought in, 40 pounds. For every scalp of such female Indian or male Indian under the age of 12 years that shall be killed, 20 pounds. Thomas Jefferson had written a paragraph of the Declaration accusing the king of transporting slaves from Africa to the colonies, and suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this commerce. This seemed to express moral indignation against slavery and the slave trade. Jefferson's personal distaste for slavery must be put along. My fault. Let me start that one over. Jefferson's personal distaste for slavery must be put alongside the fact that he owned slaves to the day he died, raped the slaves to the day he died. Behind it was a growing fear among Virginians and some other Southerners about the growing number of black slaves in the colonies, 20% of the total population, and the threat of slave revolts as the number of slaves increased. Jefferson's paragraph was removed by the Continental Congress because slaveholders themselves disagreed about the desirability of ending the slave trade. So even that gesture toward the black slave was omitted in the great manifesto of freedom of the American Revolution. The use of the phrase, "all men are created equal," was probably not a deliberate attempt to make a statement about women. It was just that women were beyond consideration as worthy of inclusion. They were politically invisible. Though practical needs gave women a certain authority in the home, on the farm, or in occupations like midwifery, they were simply overlooked in any consideration of political rights, any notions of civic equality. To say that the Declaration of Independence, even by its own language, was limited to life, liberty, and happiness for white males is not to denounce the makers and signers of the Declaration for holding the ideas expected of privileged males of the 18th century. Reformers and radicals looking discontentedly at history are often accused of expecting too much from a past political epoch. And sometimes they do. But the point of noting those outside the arc of human rights in the Declaration is not, centuries late and pointless, to lay impossible moral burdens on that time. It is to try to understand the way in which the Declaration functioned to mobilize certain groups of Americans, ignoring others. Surely inspirational language to create a secure consensus is still used in our time to cover up serious conflicts of interest in that consensus, and to cover up also the omission of large parts of the human race. The philosophy of the Declaration, that government is set up by the people to secure their life, liberty, and happiness, and is to be overthrown when it no longer exists, is often traced to the ideas of John Locke in his second treatise on the government. Treatise on the government? That was published in England in 1689, when the English were rebelling against tyrannical kings and setting up parliamentary governments. The Declaration, like Locke's second treaty, talked about government and political rights, but ignored the existing inequalities in property. And how could people truly have equal rights with stark differences in wealth? Locke himself was a wealthy man with investments in the silk trade and slave trade, incomes from loans and mortgages. He invested heavily in the first issue of the stock of the Bank of England, just a few years after he had written his second treaty as a classic statement of liberal democracy. As advisor to the Carolinas, he had suggested a government of slave owners run by wealthy land barons. Locke's statement for people's government was in support of revolution in England, for the free development of mercantile capitalism at home and abroad. Locke himself regretted that the labor of poor children is generally lost to the public till they are 12 or 14 years old, and suggested that all children over 3 of families on relief should attend working schools, so they would be from infancy required to work. The English revolutions of the 17th century brought representative government and opened up discussions of democracy. But as the English historian Christopher Hill wrote in The Puritan Revolution, the establishment of parliamentary supremacy of the rule of law no doubt mainly benefited the men of property. The kind of taxation that threatened the security of property was overthrown, monopolies were ended to give more free rein to businesses, and sea power began to be used for an imperial policy abroad, including the conquest of Ireland. The Levelers and the Diggers, two political movements which wanted to carry inequality into the economic sphere, were put down by the Revolution. One can see the reality of Locke's nice phrases about representative government in the class divisions and conflict in England. that followed the revolution that Locke supported. At the very time the American scene was becoming tense, in 1768, England was racked by rioters and strikes of coal heavers, small sawmill workers, hatters, weavers, and sailors, because of the high price of bread, and miserable wages. The Annual Register reviewed the events of the spring and summer of 1768. A general dissatisfaction unhappily prevailed among several of the lower orders of the people. This ill tempered, which was partly occasioned by the high price of provisions, and partly proceeded from other causes, too frequently manifested itself in its acts of tumult and riot, which were productive of the most melancholy consequences. The people, who were supposedly at the heart of Locke's theory of people's sovereignty, were defined by a British member of Parliament. I don't mean the mob, I mean the middling people of England, the manufacturer, the yeoman, the merchant, and the country gentleman. In America, too, the reality behind the words of the Declaration of Independence, issued the same year as Adam Smith's Capitalist Manifesto, The Wealth of Nations, was that a rising class of important people needed to enlist on their side enough Americans to defeat England, without disturbing too much of the relations of wealth and power that had developed over 150 years of colonial history. Indeed, 69% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence had held colonial office under England. When the Declaration of Independence was read, with all its flaming radical language, from the town hall balcony in Boston, it was read by Thomas Crafts, a member of the Loyal Nine, conservatives who had opposed militant action against the British. 4 days after the reading, the Boston Committee of Correspondence ordered the townspeople to show up on the common for a military draft. The rich, it turned out, could avoid the draft by paying for substitutes. The poor had to serve. This led to rioting and shouting, "Tyranny is tyranny. Let it come down from who it may." And that is the conclusion of chapter 4. And chapter 5 is titled "The Kind of Revolution." What is all this water? But I do think this book is important to read, just to understand what's going on today, just to understand the root causes of things that are happening today. So, People's History of the United States, Chapter 4. And again, I would like to reiterate what I said in the beginning. I don't know why I built it up like that, but subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe to our podcast, May 30th Alliance Podcast, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Anchor. If you need a link at all, it's links on our Facebook page, or it's links I can send to you. Same thing for the newsletter as well. I can send you the link as well. Even though I do believe I posted it yesterday. Follow us on Twitter. We're going to start doing the Spaces feature. I think that is it. Day 388. The struggle continues.